So, morning of the 12th of July 2007, you're in Iraq. Here you are. You're in the Amin district of Baghdad in Iraq, to be precise, which is all the way down here on this eastern side. So, two Apache helicopters, much like this one, flying overhead. And around 9:50 a.m., there is a group of men, about 20 men, moving through the streets. The Apache crew, manned by American soldiers, of course, mistakenly identifies camera equipment carried by two Reuters journalists, Namir Noor Eldin, I think, and Saeed Chma. I don't know how to pronounce their second names, but I'm just going to refer to them by their first names now. But they interpret this camera equipment as weapons. So because of this, the Apache crew request and receives permission to engage the group, believing they are insurgents. This is at 9:53, so 3 minutes after spotting this group of people. A minute later, the Apache crew opens fire on the group with their 30mm cannons, killing several people immediately. So Namir, one of the Reuters journalists, tries to lie on the ground to avoid getting hit, but the Apache spots him and blasts him with the cannons, killing him. Saeed tries to run away, but the gunner follows him as he's running and guns him down as well, and he lies there injured. So this is 9:54, about 6 minutes later, about 10 a.m. Van arrives to the scene, and the men inside try to assist the wounded Saeed. The helicopter crew believe these rescuers are insurgents, and they gun them down as well after getting permission to engage. About 10:01 a.m., the helicopter fires on the van. This kills more men and also injures two children inside. So after the attack, American ground forces arrive at the scene to investigate, of course, and they secure the area and they discover the wounded children in the van, and they provide medical assistance and evacuate them. And then moving on to the 5th of April 2010, WikiLeaks released a video of this event showing all of this, entitled it Collateral Murder, which is what it was. They didn't intend to, murder journalists that were there to document the conflict in Iraq. This was a mistake. And this actually came from a disillusioned intelligence analyst, then going by Bradley Manning, now goes by Chelsea Manning, different story. But they were given a 35-year prison sentence, and that, I believe, got pardoned by Obama, so they only served a small amount of it, which is also important because it informs the Julian Assange case, of course, the founder of WikiLeaks, the website which released it. And things like this, these sorts of things that governments want to keep from citizens, this is very, very important stuff, isn't it? Because Reuters had been trying to get access to the footage via Freedom of Information request since the incident happened in 2007, and they had not succeeded because, of course, the military didn't want to willingly publish their mistakes. And so this releasing actually helped the families of the victims get a bit of closure as to what happened, as well as proper investigations into this happening. However, even with pressure from Reuters and the press, because of course it was a massive scandal, the military concluded that the actions of the soldiers were in accordance with the law of armed conflict and its own rules of engagement, which is not true, really. So websites like WikiLeaks publish secret government documents to expose government crimes, I think is fair to say. I think it's uncontroversial to call this a crime. These are journalists. They didn't correctly identify weapons. That was camera equipment. None of the people seemed to be armed, in fact.
Well, I suppose you can make the argument that if they were documenting the war crimes of the Iraq War, it would be a weapon against the American government. So
that is true, yeah.
It's not cause for them to fire on them, but there's a bitter irony there.
Yeah, but the war in Iraq, which of course Britain was a part of as well, and many other countries as well, saw over 100,000 civilian casualties. And of course, this wasn't all the US military. Of course, there was an opposing side as well, which was probably far more indiscriminate. And of course, there were cases as well of Australians and British soldiers killing civilians too. But it is important to look at the cases and not bury them so we can improve upon that, right? Because ideally you want war to be conducted as cleanly as possible. Of course, it's not necessarily a perfect target to aspire to, but one should still aspire to meet it. And I thought it'd be important to talk about who is Julian Assange and why did he set up WikiLeaks? Why is it important that this sort of work can be done without being pursued by the US government? Because that's what has ultimately happened to him. So he's an Australian citizen. He was born in 1971, and he founded WikiLeaks in 2006. And in around April of 2010, as I touched on, they released this video of this helicopter which killed 11 Iraqi civilians. And then moving on another month, WikiLeaks released 91,000 documents on the Afghanistan war. And then shortly after this, Assange, I believe, was living in Sweden. Swedish prosecutors issued and then withdrew, I'm not entirely sure why, an arrest warrant for Assange over a sexual assault allegation. And we're going to revisit this later on down the line because it's quite often brought up in this case. But I think there is a certain amount where you can separate the WikiLeaks work, where it's other people submitting stuff to the website he created, and Assange, the man, right? These are two separate entities, and you can appreciate the work that goes on WikiLeaks without necessarily having to approve of the person. And so for some reason, they reopened the investigation again in September of 2010, which prompts Assange to move to the UK. And then WikiLeaks in October released 400,000 classified Iraq war files and then thousands of US diplomatic cables. And I think that this might be the thing that really sealed the deal for the US going after them, right? And the Swedish court again orders for Assange's arrest, and he is arrested in the UK but freed on bail. He then breaks the conditions of his bail, and the UK court in 2011 orders Assange to be extradited to Sweden, which he appeals. He then gets asylum in an Ecuadorian embassy in London. The Ecuadorians wanted to basically put their middle finger up to the Americans. It's just like, Americans are annoyed at this guy, so we're going to protect him as a sort of bargaining chip for our own needs. I think that's why they got involved here. But this was June of 2012. The Swedish court again wishes to uphold the arrest warrant in July of 2014. So he's been taking sort of asylum, if you will, in the embassy in London, the Ecuadorian embassy. He was there for a total of, I think, 7 years. So some of the allegations were dropped in August of 2015 due to statute of limitations, but there's still an investigation remaining. In October of 2015, the UK police end their 24-hour guard outside the embassy, but they say they will still arrest him if he leaves. And then moving on to May 2017, the Swedish prosecutors discontinue the investigation into the embassy stay. And then in April of 2019, this is where a lot of things start kicking off. He is arrested after he has his embassy stay revoked, and there's lots of speculation as to why this happened. One of the more interesting ones was he was kind of difficult to stay with.
Wasn't it rumoured that he refused to shower and therefore just smelled terrible?
Yes. I've heard a similar thing. I can't confirm it, but there are other people who have corroborated that account, that he's not a fan of showering. So, a bit unfortunate, isn't it? But it carries on. So he's sentenced for 50 weeks in prison for skipping bail in the UK, and the Swedish prosecutors reopen investigation. However, he was sent to Belmarsh prison, which is this, and this is infamous in the UK. He was also held there for in solitary confinement for 23 hours a day, and he actually ended up serving 62 months rather than 50 weeks. And Belmarsh prison is known for housing people like Abu Hamza, the Islamic hate preacher, if you will, the Lee Rigby killers, the people who beheaded an English soldier, Charles Bronson, famed, for the Tom Hardy movie about him, and worst of all, Tommy Robinson has been there as well. So yes, this is a very infamous prison. It's known as one of the strictest and one of the most harsh in terms of conditions. And so in June of 2019, the US formally requests Assange's extradition to face hacking and espionage charges. It's interesting that it took this long, isn't it? It's curious. But November of 2019, the Swedish prosecutors drop the investigation due to insufficient evidence. And then it carries on into 2020. The UK courts begin the extradition hearings delayed by COVID. And then a UK judge rules against extradition to the US due to his mental health. Which, if you've been in solitary confinement for 23 hours a day for 62 months, one can imagine that's a very legitimate thing. He's not putting it on. So UK High Court then grants US permission to appeal this decision. And then the UK High Court rules that the US assurances of fair treatment are sufficient to guarantee his extradition, because that's one of the conditions for the UK to extradite someone to another country, is that they're going to be tried in a humane fashion. And then the UK Supreme Court denies Assange's appeal against this. And then in June of 2022, the UK orders the extradition again. And then May of 23, Australian Prime Minister, I believe Anthony Albanese at that point, calls for his release, because the Australians, of course, him being an Australian national, were quite big on seeing him released. Because, of course, Australian citizenship would mean less if Australian citizens can be tried by foreign governments for conducting what amounts to journalism, right? So, the High Court said he cannot appeal his extradition after the intervention by the Australian Prime Minister, and then it goes to February of this year, 2024. His lawyers launch a final legal bid to stop this extradition. It's their final attempts to be able to get away with it. And then in March of 2024, the UK High Court requested further assurances from US authorities, which they could have given. They could have said, listen, we'll put these measures into effect that will guarantee that he has fair treatment. But they didn't do that, which is interesting. That seems like a choice, by my mind, for them not to do this. So by May of 2024, a UK judge allowed a new appeal on free speech grounds, and that his citizenship of Australia complicates the jurisdictional authority of the United States' attempts to prosecute him. And then in June, the start of this month, the US Justice Department proposed a deal which allowed Assange to walk free in exchange for a guilty plea on the Espionage Act charge. So yesterday, the 25th of June, he took an Australian private jet, because he's not allowed to fly commercially because of his alleged crimes, to Saipan, which is the capital of the Northern Mariana Islands, which is technically a US territory, but not mainland, United States, of course, because he feared retribution from the authorities. And that is where he pled guilty to one charge of breaching the Espionage Act rather than the original 18 charges he faced. Because of the time he spent in Belmarsh prison and the harsh treatment he faced, which is difficult to justify because he was a journalist, he wasn't, a physical danger to people as many of the denizens of Belmarsh prison normally are. They said that he will not face any jail time, and after he pleads guilty, he can be a free man. So he flew on to Canberra, the capital of Australia, and met his family, for the first time in a long time, I imagine, and is supposedly able to live his life again. But this isn't necessarily the victory that it looks like, because the condition of him being free was still that he had to plead guilty of reporting on the United States breaking laws, killing innocent people, killing journalists. And so this isn't necessarily the victory that it looks like, because there are conditions to his freedom, and he's still looking to get pardoned as well. And here's WikiLeaks posting about him touching down in Australia, and it's, freedom flight and all of that sort of stuff, but I don't think it's quite as positive as that. So let's have a quick look at this sexual assault case. Ever so briefly, The Telegraph did an article about the book that Anna Ardin wrote, one of the accusers. There were two. And I'm just going to read a little bit from this because I'm going to read it directly, but one, because I don't want to be victim of, a libel lawsuit, not alleging anything, but this is what it says. The book adds details to the accusations that led prosecutors to arrest Mr. Assange in absentia following accusations of unlawful coercion and sexual harassment that Assange held her down roughly after they agreed to have consensual sex and then deliberately sabotaged a condom so he could ejaculate into her. When she first met him in her flat, Mr. Assange greets her holding onto one of her bras. I've been looking through your underwear drawer, he says. I saw the size of this and thought this is a woman I'd like to meet. And if this is true, of course, this is pretty creepy, immoral behaviour, in my opinion. But it carries on to say, in the days he stayed there, he never showers, so by the last day, the flat smells strongly of unwashed body, of dried-in sweat, and there are turds floating in the toilet in this lady's flat. And but apparently, after this event went on, she went to a party with him and tweeted about how much of a nice time she's having.
This is my point of confusion. If he really is that disgusting, and there seems to be corroborating accounts suggesting that he doesn't shower, why would you consensually have sex with him?
Well, funnily enough, that's the next part of this article. Part of what makes Miss Arden's account interesting is that she includes new details that some say may give ammunition to her doubters. She was already considering sleeping with Mr. Assange even before he made a clumsy pass, she says, partly because of his celebrity and partly to irritate her ex. And then this is a direct quote, "It might be a pretty fun thing and no big deal to score with Julian Assange," she remembers thinking.
Right.
So she's thinking that after he's come with her underwear, saying that he's rooted through her underwear Before, and that was just the part that sealed the deal.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay.
Apparently so.
Apparently so.
I have questions.
Also,
yes.
I will say from this account, it doesn't follow to me that simply because a man doesn't shower very often, that he wouldn't know to flush the toilet. There's an element of taking it the extra mile there. But of course, that's conjecture, speculation, subjective opinion on my part.
Of course, but there were accounts from the Ecuadorian embassy that he was
Lacking in the personal hygiene department.
He was interested in preserving water supplies. Let's just say that.
And after Josh's own heart.
Excuse me, I shower every day. But I think one of the key questions here is, why did this happen now? Obviously, this has been going on since 2010, but why has it taken 14 years, and why specifically now? So the more sort of perfunctory explanation would be the involvement from the Australian Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese of the Labour Party. He played a key part, and there were lots of Australians that were very central in pushing for his freedom, and obviously, give credit. And, he is a member of the Labour Party as well, so, it's rare for me to give credit. But yeah, fair play on this matter. I think I agree with them, and lots of the Australian campaigners that also were involved. Also, that High Court decision in London, which allowed Assange to appeal against being extradited to the US one final time, that was very central. And I think it also matches prevailing public opinion that most people actually supported his right to publish these documents and to expose these crimes. But from a more cynical perspective, and me being a cynical man, the one that I agree with more, the US has demonstrated that they can persecute journalists for publishing damaging information about them, because he's been hounded since he published that in 2010. He's been having to live in an Ecuadorian embassy. He's having to travel around the world. He had to spend time in solitary confinement in one of the harshest prisons in Britain. These are not pleasant things. This will make journalists think twice before publishing this sort of thing. And so they've already sort of achieved their aims already. And there's also the fact that the information that Assange published and what Assange says could be regarded as damaging Biden's campaign. And in the run-up to the November US election, if they brought him to the US and tried him in the US, that would be running alongside the US election. And therefore, that wouldn't look good for them, because he'll be saying lots of damaging things about the Democrats and Biden and the Clintons and Obama and all of those sorts of people. And
the Trump camp for some time has said they will pardon Assange. So I understand that it was at the Libertarian Convention that Trump decided to gatecrash and steal the show at, that he said he would, after he was questioned about it backstage by Tim Pool. But months before that, his son Don Jr. had committed, I believe it was on Tim's show as well, to pardoning Assange because he had revealed such important and damning evidence about the Iraq War and the dubious actions of the Clintons on the world stage. So I think that only benefits the Trump campaign. I think by taking that off the table as something Trump can promise to do, the Biden administration thinks this is a low-cost way of ensuring he doesn't get voters on this one issue.
And was it either you or Dan that said one of the terms of his, plea deal, that's the one, was that he takes down the Clinton emails?
That has been suggested. So I've seen screenshots circulating this morning. I remember it being reclipped by aggregate account end wokeness. That on the WikiLeaks site, I think lots of the Clinton emails are only accessible now via the archive. I think that many of the files have been removed, and so there has been suggestion, not confirmation, suggestion, that part of the plea deal was to remove certain files from WikiLeaks.
Yeah, so it is too early yet to be able to know for sure whether that has actually happened. So I don't want to, give you misinformation and all that stuff. I hate that word now, by the way. It's been ruined. But there are some interesting things that are still present on there. So this is a screenshot from this. If I can move that out of the way. But yes, WikiLeaks does run on donations. But this is an exchange from the 1st of February 2008 titled "Niet Means Niet, Russians' NATO Enlargement Red Lines." And it's talking about something that Nigel Farage in the UK was talking about recently, actually, and got in a lot of trouble for. So this is very interesting. So it says, Ukraine and Georgia's NATO aspirations not only touch a raw nerve in Russia, they engender serious concerns about the consequences for stability in the region. Not only does Russia perceive encirclement and efforts to undermine Russia's influence in the region, but it also fears unpredictable and uncontrolled consequences which would seriously affect Russian security interests. Experts tell us that Russia is particularly worried that the strong divisions in Ukraine over NATO membership, with much of the ethnic Russian community against membership, could lead to a major split involving violence or at worst civil war. In that eventuality, Russia would have to decide whether to intervene, a decision Russia does not want to have to face. So that's interesting in and of itself. But what's more interesting is who it came from. So this came from the now current director of the CIA, William J. Burns, who then was the US ambassador to Russia. So that suggests that actually the US has been aware that this was a fault line since at least 2008.
Well, one of the ones that Farage has been referring to, and lots of critics of the Ukraine war, was the conversation between Mikhail Gorbachev and the then Secretary of State of the United States in 1994, when he said we won't move 1 inch further to the Russian border. And I believe before the end of his life, Gorbachev then said, well, this isn't on record, there was no such conversation, whereas the actual Secretary of State himself has said it. And so it seems to be this, the 1994 promise in the Russian mind, that America, through the expansion of EU and NATO membership, has reneged on that commitment, and therefore this is the justification that Putin and the like are giving for waging war in Ukraine.
Yes, and these sorts of things being released to the public seems to back up this sort of assertion, doesn't it? Which lots of people have been getting in trouble for in the Western world, but actually does seem to be true based on these communications, which have been confirmed as genuine. So now I've sort of laid it all out on the table. What do you guys think of the whole case, the whole scenario? Have you got any particular thoughts about the persecution of Assange? Should we be defending him? Did he do good work? That sort of thing.
I'm happy to have this information be more transparent, considering I think the Iraq and Afghanistan and the like wars were utterly illegitimate and very shady. Yeah. I think this isn't all the skeletons in the Clintons' closets. Especially with their affiliation with Jeffrey Epstein. I also would be interested to see what's going to happen with Edward Snowden, because obviously he's tied up in all this. The complicated part for regime optics is if they pardon Assange but not Snowden, because Snowden's currently in Russia, then it looks like they have an unwavering commitment to this kind of transparency. And I think even the Trump camp is going to get tripped up on that one. So I think that will be a tripwire they have to negotiate in the next few years.
Well, you know me. I believe that we're ruled, and I believe the evidence shows that we're ruled by an international criminal cabal, and anything that hurts them or makes them sweat a little bit is a positive, as far as I'm concerned. What happened to Assange is not something I'd really looked into, so I'm very glad that you went through the case and what happened to him. I think it's terrible, and I think the persecution, while understandable from a defensive perspective, was awful. unnecessary. But for what it was trying to do, it sent the message. And while I'm very, very glad that he's now free, obviously what he went through is going to be sticking in the back of any journalist's mind who has integrity when they go to release anything that could put them in hot water.
Mm-hmm. Hear, hear. So I think that is a very important summary of this. I think this is going to actually set a sort of bar for prosecution of journalists the Western world over. And it's actually quite a worrying thing. Sure, he's free, but at what cost?
Hi folks, thanks for watching. This is a clip from a broader podcast called the Podcast of the Lotus Eaters. It's live 1 p.m. every day UK time, Monday to Friday. And if you want to support us, you can sign up for £5 a month, help us keep the lights on, because of course we're demonetized here, and go and watch Lads Hour. Lads Hour is one of my favourite shows because it's basically, and I guess there's no easy way to describe it, than calling it The View, but for men. We talk about whatever we want, but from an unabashedly masculine perspective, and we have a great time doing it. So come over and watch that.